You want me to create it?
You know what? I just do it on mine. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, actually, yeah, you will. Sorry, you will have to. Yeah, you will have to click it for that. Yeah. I'm going to go really quickly with the intro because time is an issue.
For everyone presenting, please do not change the size of the slide deck. Just click the left bottom arrow in the corner of the screen for your next slide. If you change the slide deck, it changes for everybody. So just we have it sized to fit. We know that the next slide is showing at the bottom, but just click the down arrow for your next slide when it's time for you to present.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the YouthPower Learning webinar entitled Positive Youth Development for HIV/AIDS and Sexual and Reproductive Health Programming. What do we know? My name is Chasinna Kapungu, and I serve as Senior Gender and Youth Advisor for YouthPower Learning. This webinar will be focused on sector-specific findings from a systematic review that was published a few months ago on the implementation and evidence base on positive youth development in low and middle income countries. Today's webinar will focus on sector-specific findings from HIV/AIDS and SRH, and these findings will be published in a brief later this month. During the webinar, we will also highlight a few programs that demonstrate the impact of PYD on cross-sectoral outcomes. YouthPower Learning advances solutions to improve lives. Through integrated research and development programs to improve the capacity of youth-led and youth-serving engaged institutions. Our definition for positive youth development is about building young people's skills, assets, and competencies, fostering healthy relationships, strengthening the enabling environment, and transforming systems. How can we partner together? Well, on our website, we have a series which identifies what works. We also have a series of resources such as the PYD Measurement Toolkit. We also list events and other information which are on our learning hub of youthpower.org. And we also encourage you to join one of our communities of practices. We have 4 focused on youth and peace and security, gender and positive youth development, youth engagement, cross-sectoral skills, and also we have a list of activities from various YouthPower projects. And throughout the year, we also provide grants under contracts, and you're welcome to look at our website to submit an application when we actually open those up. So for today, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Marty Skinner. She's a research scientist at the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington. Dr. Skinner will provide a summary of the systematic review findings. Next, we will have Dr. Alice Wellborn. She's founding director of Salamander Trust in the United Kingdom, and she will discuss, highlight findings from Stepping Stones, which is one of the programs featured in the systematic review. We also have Andrew Gibbs, who's a senior specialist at the Gender and Health Research Unit at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. He will also talk about an adaptation of Stepping Stones, which is called Stepping Stones Creating Futures. And lastly, we have Katie Plord, who is Senior Technical Advisor within the Global Health Population and Nutrition Department at FHI 360. She will discuss the USAID activities through YouthPower Action. In terms of logistics, please write down any questions in the chat box. We will keep a record of those questions, and at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A, and then we'll have a closing remarks. So I would like to now hand it over to Dr. Marty Skinner, who will talk about the systematic review.
Good morning. It's nice to be here with all of you. As Jacinta said, I'm Marty Skinner. I'm at the University of Washington, and I've been here for about 12 years in the Social Development Research Group, working on a variety of things, including program evaluations of positive youth development type programs in the United States primarily. And with a large team of people participated in putting together the systematic review as well as the toolkit, which is a very helpful tool that I hope that all of you have seen or will see in the near future. So this webinar is really focused on the programs that we found in our systematic review that relate to sexual reproductive health and HIV/AIDS prevention. And this, the next slide, can you see the next slide? There. So the systematic review and the toolkit are both available on the youthpower.org website, and we'll come back to that later on. First, I want to talk a little bit about what positive youth development is and how we selected these programs that are part of the systematic review. And as Jacinta said, it's really a positive approach which engages youth along with their families and their communities and or their government so that youth are empowered to reach their full potential. It approaches building skills, assets, and competencies. It fosters healthy relationships and strengthens the environment in order to transform the world that youth live in and participate in. And this approach, which has been growing in more high-income countries over the last 30 to 50 years, is really a departure from the more traditional approach, which focuses on problems and thinks of young people as a source of problems. Instead, this positive approach seeks to support youth in a holistic, proactive way, which has the advantage of having an impact on a great many outcomes, not just one very specific outcome. This slide has a lot on it, and I'm going to walk through different pieces of it over the next few slides so that we can make these ideas more concrete. So in our attempt to make sense of the literature on positive youth development programming in low and middle income countries, we not only needed to come up with a pretty clear definition, but we also needed to sort of organize the multitude of constructs and issues and variables embedded in this very broad idea. We needed to organize that in some way that would make it more manageable for us and easier for other people to understand. And we came up with this 4-domain format of thinking about all the pieces that go into positive youth development. And you could organize these things in many different ways. So this doesn't mean this is really the only way to do it, but this helped us. So we think about the domains of positive youth development as including assets, which are resources, skills, and competencies, agency, which is the ability to employ those assets, contribution, which is youth actually being engaged in their own futures and in the development of their communities, and the enabling environment, which is all the things around the youth that support that positive, healthy development. And I'm going to unpack that just a little bit because I think it's important to be concrete. So assets means that youth need the resources and skills to achieve desired outcomes. And, you know, resources can be money or housing or schooling. Skills include things like communication skills and emotion regulation and problem solving. But it also includes very specific kinds of skills that may have to do with job training or how to put a condom on and where to find them, things like that. Agency is really about the ability to employ those assets and aspirations to influence or make your own decisions and set your own goals, and to act on those decisions to achieve the desired outcomes without fear of violence or retribution. So that includes things like self-efficacy, positive identity, a future orientation, or an optimistic view of yourself in the future. Making a contribution really means engaging youth as a source of change for their own and their community's positive development. So that might look like civic activity or leadership or mentoring, which is something that's often employed in positive youth development programming. And then the enabling environment, which I sometimes feel like we should talk about first, but somehow ended up at the end of the list in all of our documents. But it really means that the youth is surrounded by an environment that maximizes their assets, agency, access to services and opportunities, their ability to avoid risks and stay safe and secure and protected while promoting their social and emotional competence to thrive. And this really has to do with, in many cases, relationships with other people that are positive and helpful and supportive to the youth. It means being in an environment where there are positive opportunities and there are healthy norms and where there are safe places for kids to grow into productive adults. So in this framework, we have identified that there are features of positive youth development programs in common across programs. And these features are part of what identify a program as being P1E. These programs build skills and they engage youth in making a contribution. So these features are very much come right out of the domain. These programs work to build healthy relationships and promote bonding, belonging, and membership. So not just bonding to particular people, but a sense of belonging to a positive group or membership in a larger team. And they provide clear and consistent positive norms, create safe places, and provide access to youth-friendly services and integrated services to reduce that the interference with using services that youth often encounter. So here's another sort of busy slide from our brief on HIV/AIDS and sexual reproductive health. But I think it's important to get a sort of concrete idea of what kind of activities go into these programs. And many of you are engaged in these programs, so this is not going to come as a surprise to you. There are a lot of educational activities that are led by adults or facilitated by adults, often teachers in schools, but frequently people with special training to do this particular kind of activity. There's a lot of peer education in these programs we found in the systematic review. Of course, there's a lot of use of media to convey ideas and concepts, but also to demonstrate specific skills. Activities with parents and teachers, I have to say, were primarily activities with teachers and other trained adults. There were fewer instances of actual programs that had specific activities for parents and youth to do together. There were some with physical activities, a few with home-based services, but those were not the primary strategies used. Often these programs include community meetings or bringing young people together or providing services that are more youth-friendly. So, not surprisingly, we found that some of these evaluations were randomized controlled trials, which provide very strong evidence for efficacy, and some were not. So there were 55 programs in the systematic review that addressed sexual reproductive health or HIV/AIDS prevention. Of those 55 programs, 18 had an experimental trial. They were spread out across the globe, but most of the experimental evaluations were conducted in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where there has been, a lot of funding around HIV prevention. And not surprisingly, I hope to any of you, we did find among those rigorously evaluated programs that there was pretty solid evidence that these programs had impacts on the desired targets of the programs, which included self-efficacy for condom use, increased contraceptive use, and utilization of sexual and reproductive health services. We also found evidence that these programs reduce sexual risk behavior, including multiple partners, unprotected sex, and particularly for girls, who reported fewer incidences of unwilling sexual activity. So we found good solid evidence that these programs have impact on the targeted outcomes. But positive youth development is a holistic approach, and many of these programs also targeted other outcomes because I'm sure you all know sexual and reproductive health and HIV prevention are linked to other parts of the youth's life. They're linked to gender norms and job opportunities and mental health and connectedness to the environment and characteristics of the environment to which these youth are connected. So we think it's important to convey that these programs had related but non-physical health outcomes as well. So we saw in some programs significant impact on a reduction in child marriage, which is a high risk for poor sexual and reproductive health and other kinds of sexual risk, that had an impact on education, particularly for girls staying in school, and that participants had more positive attitudes toward gender equality and towards marriage based on personal choice, which is often discussed as marrying for love instead of being in arranged marriages. We also saw for some programs that targeted livelihood outcomes that they had impact on working for pay, generating your own business, the ability to generate income, and reduction in food insecurity. We also saw some programs with significant impact on mental health outcomes, some reductions in substance use, and some evidence of having a stronger sense of solidarity or trust in adults in the community, particularly in teachers, and believing that teachers care. So we really try to emphasize with positive youth development programming that the payoff is you can have impact on your specific targeted outcomes, but you can also have impact on related outcomes, and that builds opportunities for collaboration with people who are focused on related outcomes and potentially multiple funding streams that might be dedicated to different kinds of outcomes. We also believe, although most of the evaluations are not conducted in a way that we can really claim this with certainty, but we believe that by having an impact on these related outcomes, that increases the likelihood of getting a solid impact on your targeted outcome, that there's a synergy in these related topics. So, let me go back. So in summary, we just want to say, again, that there were 108 studies altogether. There were 55 that were identified as related to the sexual reproductive health or HIV/AIDS prevention. Of those, 18, or about 33%, had experimental evaluations. We also found that these programs were cross-sectoral and that activities target improving outcomes in health, democracy and government and education. The gender norm equality issue also seemed to have some impact on unwilling sexual activity and violence. We did find that there, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, that there were more evaluations and more rigorous evaluations for programs focused on HIV risk behaviors because there's been a more steady stream of funding in that area and less evidence in the more general sexual reproductive health outcomes like family planning and fertility reduction. So we did draw some conclusions. As I pointed out earlier, the study showed that PYD programs have FHH and HIV/AIDS specific outcomes, which improved self-efficacy. These programs, some of them were girl or boy specific, gender specific, but most of them weren't, although those that weren't often had activities that were tailored for males and females separately, and some of which were conducted separately. And we saw impact for both boys and girls on self-efficacy to use condoms with their partners, contraceptives used, and the utilization of services. And the reduction in sexual risk behaviors such as multiple partners, the incidence of unprotected sex, and for girls, reports of fewer incidents of unwilling sex. These programs also appeared to strengthen social, emotional, and cognitive competencies and improve a sense of agency and created a more enabling environment. So out of that comes some recommendations. The first recommendation is that there need to be high-quality evaluations in order to build the evidence base of what works in this area. There were more high-quality randomized trials in the sexual reproductive health and HIV prevention area than in many other targeted areas, but there are still a lot of programs that have not been evaluated in this way. And so we need more of those evaluations, particularly in the sexual and reproductive health outcomes area, where we did not see many programs that were rigorously evaluated for outcomes like family planning and fertility reduction. We also really didn't see experimentally evaluated programs in Latin America. We saw few in Asia, but even fewer in the Latin American countries. And obviously programming is happening there, but there haven't been many high-quality evaluations of those programs. So, and we know that regions are different. Culturally, they're different. Norms are different. Resources are different. So it's important that these programs get evaluated in all of the contexts in which they are implemented. And our final recommendation is to engage youth in every phase of the project, design, implementation, and evaluation. One of the key core elements of positive youth development is that it doesn't treat youth as a problem to be solved or as people to be acted on or that services just need to be delivered to them. They are actually an enormous, valuable resource who, in both they and the rest of us, really benefit from youth being involved in all the phases of these projects. It not only gets buy-in from them and improves the likelihood of having the impact that you desire, but it has big implications for building skills for those youth as they're involved in this in every phase of the programming. And they take those skills to the next part of their life. And since we're doing this sort of programming, making the design and implementation and evaluation of the program itself a vehicle for developing skills and agency, assets and agency, making them part of the enabling environment, making that the way that they learn how to make a contribution and become motivated to make a contribution is very important. So I'm just going to point out again that this full systematic review and all of the briefs that we're producing around this systematic review are available on the youthpower.org website. The PYD measurement toolkit is also available there. It is full of useful information about how to integrate these positive youth development concepts into every phase of your program development and implementation and evaluation. And we are also available if you look at these resources and you want to use them. If you have any questions, you can contact us. And because this is the purpose of YouthPower, is to build the capacity of people in the field to use positive youth development and to build the evidence for what works and frankly what doesn't work, because not everything works in every situation. So I just want to acknowledge everybody who participated in the systematic review and development of the tool, getting it out there to you. It's been a great experience, and I hope all of you find it helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Skinner, for that presentation on the systematic review. Next, we have Dr. Alice Wellborn, Founding Director of Salamander Trust in the United Kingdom, who will discuss stepping stones.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Alice.
Right, okay. So I'd like to start by explaining a bit about my organization, Salamander Trust, and our life cycle approach to the training programs that we have. In the picture in the middle here, you'll see there's a drawing by women in Zimbabwe in the mid-1990s showing a wife being beaten by her husband, who was chasing her away with the children they'd had together. And in response to this, we've taken a life cycle approach, recognizing that violence against children, if they experience that growing up, means that they may also become perpetrators or recipients of violence as teenagers and as adults. So we have our 4M Plus project, which is a peer mentor training led by and for women living with HIV as they go through the pregnancy journey and supporting them through the early years of a child's life. Then we also have our new Stepping Stones with Children program designed for use with orphans and other vulnerable children aged 5 to 14 and their caregivers, and I talked about this in a webinar earlier this year. Then we also have the original Stepping Stones and the wholly revised and updated version of this, Stepping Stones and Stepping Stones Plus, which is for around 15-year-olds and upwards, including adults, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So, what is Stepping Stones? It's a highly interactive training process. It's been in use for over 2 decades. I was diagnosed with HIV in 1992, so I developed it in order to try to make some sense of what had happened to me. It addresses gendered human rights issues in the context of HIV. It facilitates community members to explore issues in peer groups and arrive at important changes. And you see there on the slide a brief history of different stages of development of the program, and at the bottom there, the 2 recent programs I've just described. So what does Stepping Stones focus on? First of all, it really focuses on gender equality and empowerment. Nicole Harberland in 2015 highlighted how important gender and power should be as key characteristics in effective sexuality and HIV education. Stepping Stones was included as one example there. It primarily focuses on activities with males and with females separately, just as the PYD systematic review found to be most effective. It has 4 peer groups based on gender and age, which implicitly enables individuals to explore 360-degree relationships. to think about their relationships with their own peers and between children and their parents, as well as with sexual partners who may be older or younger than them or the same age, and secret relationships, including those between young women and sugar daddies, without overtly pointing the finger at anyone and saying, you have to come to the workshop with your sexual partner. Then all activities are based on participants' own experiences or those of someone like me. So I'll explain a bit more about that. So what formal evidence do we have? From the 2008 RCT of the South African MRC adaptation by Rachel Jukes and colleagues, it showed reduced risk of herpes simplex and reduced intimate partner violence by male participants, as well as reduced casual sex and problem drinking. But there were no statistically significant effects on HIV reduction. However, the qualitative research did show that the program generally empowered participants to take control of various aspects of their lives. It doesn't entirely surprise us that the HIV reduction had no statistically significant effects, because RCTs are so expensive, especially when blood tests are involved. So the RCT only worked with 2 younger peer groups of young men and young women, and no older peer groups. A publication in The Lancet in January this year by Oliveira et al. Using phylogenetic testing in South Africa illustrates how, on the whole, younger women of 17 or 18 or so are having sex with and acquiring HIV from young men who are about 8 years older than them. And those young men, in turn, are acquiring HIV from other women of similar age to themselves. So basically, what's probably happening in this RCT2 was that because those older men really weren't there, and the younger men weren't dating young men in the young men's peer group, there weren't enough young men with HIV in the young men's peer group in the first place to show an HIV reduction. And this may also explain in part the less positive results for young women's progress in the RCT. So this highlights one of the challenges of relying on RCTs for this kind of research, great though many of the results were, because of their expense and the limitations on what can be done with them. So I'll talk more about evaluations later. Next, stepping stone structure. Some people think stepping stones have no structure, and that's incorrect. It's just that it's not explicit, and that's on purpose because the idea is that program facilitators and participants can work out for themselves what's going on in the story of their lives without being told, today you're going to learn about X, Y, and Z. So it's very much a self-exploratory experiential process. So there's a clear progressive structure, which I've shown here like a staircase or like climbing a mountain, and you can't just jump in halfway. It moves forward from the bottom with some basic cooperation skills and group dynamics, some basic knowledge skills around HIV, safer sex, condoms, male circumcision, and so on, and then moving into why do we behave as we do, and critical literacy, which I'll describe later, and then ways in which we can change, what solutions we have, what aspirations do we have, and then lastly, moving forward together. Stepping stones has what we call some basic foundation stones when it comes to adaptation. These include involvement of all stakeholders, as I've just described, holistic responses to HIV, which again fits in strongly with the PYD framework, focusing on rights-based multiple positive outcomes, so that all can address their own most pressing issues. And this really supports ownership and sustainability of the process by the community. It's also very experiential learning with no expectation of literacy skills. And it has a fission and fusion approach, which I'll explain next, with around 50 hours of contact time. Then we see facilitators as guides, not teachers, a stress on confidentiality, which isn't about ensuring confidentiality, but is about building mutual respect between different people and perspectives. Then all the way through, we emphasize a forward-looking, assets-based, positive approach. Fission and fusion. Here you have a roadmap on the left describing the process. You create, first of all, safety at the top in those separate peer groups based on age and gender in those first few sessions. Then by sharing every few sessions, you're sharing across genders and generations of different experiences and perspectives from your own. You're building bridges between those peer groups through shared identities and people recognizing, oh, we have more in common than we have different between us. So moving from a sense of identity to we-identity across the community and creating shared solutions. And then finally, at the bottom, acting together. Here are some examples of how stepping stones have been adapted in many different contexts and cultures and continents. And I'm afraid you're going to have to come back to this slide later because I need to press on here. And we also have a variety of different evaluations as well as the RCT in South Africa from different continents. So again, you might like to come back to this slide. So how do stepping stones relate to the Positive Youth Development Framework? Here we see the image of the PYD domains we saw earlier, and it really addresses all 4 domains. It takes a gendered and human rights holistic approach. It treats all participants as equals, young and old, male and female. It promotes assets, it builds agency, it ensures contribution, and it really creates that enabling environment. And here we see how stepping stones connects with all 3 sectors that the PYD framework covers. It's just the subsectors in italics on the left which it doesn't necessarily connect with, although in fact our new Stepping Stones with Children program covers nearly all of them. There are many examples in programs around the world found by implementers of, ooh, we didn't plan this, but it's ended child marriage, or, oh, we didn't expect this, but now imams have sanctioned condom distribution. And this is the interesting thing. They haven't explicitly been included as potential outcomes in the evaluations, but this highlights how complex the approach is and multisectoral. So these just pop up as unexpected outcomes. And we've also had repeated observations that the program acts as a catalyst or springboard for other work, such as in Mozambique for post-conflict reconciliation and peace building. And we'll hear a bit more about this from Andy too. And also this highlights the need for more holistic approaches to evaluation across sectors and including communities. So I want to give you some examples of adaptations, and I haven't got time to go into this one in depth, but it's a slum community in Dar es Salaam, young people, alcohol, drugs, gun use, violence against women and girls, sinking rubbish piles, transformed through this stepping stones process, and Dominic, an extraordinary youth outreach worker from Posada, into these amazing environments where the young people cleared up the whole community and started doing income generation around tree nurseries instead. So do follow that link. Then a little more time to look at the program in the Gambia, where they had both formal and participatory reviews going on. Participants started by choosing their own priority from the outset in respect that HIV wasn't considered a big issue by them. The team doing the implementation were very clever in promoting condoms as fertility protectors rather than to stop having babies, so the community welcomed them and distributed them. Sorry, this is a bit small, but this table of the peer group's own priority issues is shown from the program start. These were their own lists, not prompted by anyone. And you can see where I've drawn red circles where older and young women identified so-called wife-beating and forced sex in the now column, and these weren't mentioned by men at all, anywhere. A year later, there was a participatory review with the groups in simultaneous meetings, so there was no conferring. When asked what positive changes they'd seen, you can see there are supposed to be red flags going along the edge there, just to the left of the W column. You can see them as black flags. Where something has been mentioned by at least 2 groups, including women, or by women alone. So, for example, there was more dialogue in the home mentioned, less quarrelling between couples, more trust and confidence between couples, then also more husbands providing fish money, which means men handing over some of their income to support the household, men helping out with difficult household tasks, safer sex, even outside marriage, and also talking to children about sex. So this really shows you how things have transformed, even though men hadn't initially mentioned the basic issues described by women at all. They could see for themselves how much better life was for them now and how it had improved. So that was a really exciting example of how things had really changed. Even though HIV wasn't considered an issue by them, inevitably there are linkages there which would have had knock-on effects. And there are other examples from around the world, from Fiji about youth setting up a youth council, from India about the ending child marriage I mentioned, young conscripted soldiers in Angola reducing alcohol, reducing violence and increasing condom use, and girls in Uganda and Kenya staying in school. Lots of other examples, and do please take a look at this slide again also. Okay, so now let's consider some challenges with M&E. There are huge limitations with cost and complexity of M&E processes for NGOs, who normally can't publish their great programs in peer-reviewed journals, so they often never get heard about. I mentioned the limitations of RCTs earlier. There's a really interesting report commissioned for DFID reviewing effective violence against women program evaluations, and this states, evaluations in the field of violence against women and girls should be designed and interpreted in consultation with evaluation users, that's implementers of the intervention, donors, and beneficiaries, to ensure evaluators obtain the right data, interpret it correctly, and produce recommendations that are adapted to the evaluation purpose. So this is really promoting a new direction for effective evaluation processes. We've taken this up and have made use of it in what we call the ALIVE framework, which Andy and I and other partners have researched with UNAIDS. This looks at how we can invest in a holistic research matrix to strengthen and expand the evidence base. This is coming out very shortly. And we feel this is a real way forward for evaluating these kinds of multi-sectoral programs. Finally, I've been asked to comment on some key components of good HIV programs. It's quite a list, as you can see. And first of all, mutual interlinkages between violence and HIV in both directions, both before and after diagnosis, are really key because they have such a knock-on effect on women themselves and on their children through the life cycle. And violence also affects women's capacity to start and to adhere to treatment, and that's absolutely vital to get right too. Secondly, good HIV programs need to be solution-focused and aspirational, as the PYD framework highlights. And there really needs to be equal involvement of young women and young men throughout the programming process. There's a critical need, I keep mentioning, to work across the genders and generations. Social norms change work takes a lot of time, needs a holistic approach, is multisectoral, and there is a report just coming out by a group of us called the CAST, which is based on our collective experiences of developing 8 evidence-based programs around the world. And this report highlights some of the key principles which we see around social norms change, which really underline what I'm saying here. Then that critical literacy again, that analysis of power imbalances at every stage of a program, so that individual participants can work out for themselves what's going on in their lives, the whys and wherefores of why we behave as we do, and how we could change, and really understanding perspectives from others' shoes in the community. And then there's the livelihoods option, the poverty driver, which Andy will talk us through in a minute. Final slide. Good adaptation is essential. Good training is essential. Facilitators need time, and they really need good ongoing support. There are no shortcuts. The current funding climate, alas, is so against us. The short time scale for projects, with scale up often based on numbers, on quantity rather than on quality. We really need to think about how we can address this. Last but not least, that initial investment in trainers is so important, and yet staff retention is now minimal. So much employment now is just contract-based rather than real investment in staff experience. We really need to support long-term trainers, including young people who have so-called graduated from the program, who would be amazing. So there's a lot of fundamental issues that I think we need to address there. But my time's out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, for the presentation on stepping stones. Next, we have Dr. Andrew Gibbs. He's Senior Specialist at the Gender and Health Research Unit at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa.
Well, thanks everyone, and thanks to the previous two presenters, which have set up very nicely for what I'm going to talk about. And so, as Alice kind of has mentioned, the work I've been involved in for maybe the past 5 to 8 years has really been looking at an adaptation of stepping stones by adding on a livelihood strengthening component. So the whole package is now, we've called it Stepping Stones in Creating Futures. And it really builds off a lot of what was found through the initial work that Alice has done over the kind of previous years, and builds off all of that and takes many of the same ideas forward. So really I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to quickly kind of recap some of the same ideas and things that has already been talked about why did we do this intervention, why did we develop it, what does it look like, just to kind of reinforce a couple of key points, and then talk about a pilot study we did, and then the current study we're now doing, which is a much larger one, and then also reflect on some of the implementation issues that we've been faced with as we've gone into doing it at a much larger scale, for us, much larger scale. So we did this intervention. Why did we develop this adaptation of stepping stones? Why did we develop Creating Futures? So back in 2012, which is about 5 years ago now, just before then, because it's when it got published, we did a review, and kind of as the systematic review that Marty talked about earlier kind of said, you know, there's lots of promising work out there. This was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, so there was a bit less evidence at that point. But we really found that there's loads of work around gender interventions, gender transformative interventions, and economic interventions. But we found that they tended to be done amongst older women, amongst more stable populations, so really rural settings, and they'd struggled to work with younger women. There had been some really promising approaches, but they hadn't seen the outcomes that we'd kind of like at that point. And then there'd been this big issue of a lack of involvement of men. And it was either men were rarely included, and where they were, it was tended to be as women's partner. And yet we knew there was a huge amount of work happening around economic interventions for men. And no one had really thought about what does it mean to include men more comprehensively. And I redid a kind of similar review, slightly different focus, looking at economic interventions. And I think we found very similar findings, which we just had published earlier this year. And there, in addition, we found that there wasn't much attempt in many of these interventions to measure both IPV outcomes, intimate partner violence outcomes, and at the same time a range of HIV outcomes. So they tended just to focus on IPV or HIV. And given what we've talked about and what people know about the overlap, hugely important that we start measuring both of those at times. Okay. And so just to say, why did we use stepping stones? Because it's the gender transformative intervention with the best evidence. And Alice has already mentioned Rachel's review. And I guess one of the key things that was found in the 2008 study, as Alice said, was there wasn't such an impact on young women. And one of the hypothesized reasons was because of the ongoing economic dependence on men. So that's kind of why we started this stream of work. So what does Creating Futures look like, and Stepping Stones in Creating Futures? In our work, because of working in informal settlements, where the dynamics of relationships are quite different, and there isn't so much the kind of age hierarchies in the same way that we can work with, we only work with younger people, so 18 to 30. As with Stepping Stones, the original, we tend to separate them into men's groups and women's groups, and typically we keep them separated. There are about 2 sessions now where we work together. So the Creating Futures is complementary to Stepping Stones. Our assumption is that Stepping Stones is run first, and it's a South African adaptation, so it's only 10 sessions of Stepping Stones. We then have 11 sessions on Creating Futures. And Creating Futures, so together it's about 21 sessions, about 63 hours of content time, so quite intensive. Creating Futures, it's about livelihoods, about livelihoods. So we're not teaching people how to do specific vocational training, kind of things like how to sew, but rather about how to use the resources available to them. It's about networking, about how to get and keep jobs. So given the structure of the economy in South Africa, it's likely they'll end up in lots of short-term jobs. So it's not a kind of simple training session. That's what it looks like broadly. So in 2012, I think, we started a pilot. So here we had about 230 young people, slightly more women than men, just because of recruitment processes. And we did a follow-up. Everyone got the intervention, and we followed them up at 6 months and 12 months quantitatively. We also did lots of qualitative research to start to understand kind of the unintended consequences that Alice talked about, and also how these kind of interventions might work in these specific kind of contexts. And this was all in urban informal settlements around Durban, so kind of quite different to where many of the interventions have been piloted or evaluated before. So what did we find? I guess I just wanted to highlight that we saw a range of different outcomes. So some are very much focused on reductions in intimate partner violence, some on gender, some on livelihoods, and some on kind of more SRH, so around condom use and kind of sexual partners. So for women, our kind of main finding for women was we saw a reduction in women's experiences of sexual intimate partner violence in the past 3 months. So about a third of women reported there was a 34% reduction. We didn't see men's perpetration decline of violence, whether physical or sexual. It could be that this only happens at 2 years, as a number of bigger studies have suggested. But amongst women and men, we did see more gender equitable attitudes, and amongst men, a reduction in controlling behaviours. So we saw this big shift in kind of gender attitudes and not fully practices, but kind of trends towards things we'd like to see happen. We also saw, as Marty said, a number of other good kind of positive outcomes, which was around earnings and kind of food security and hunger being reduced amongst women and men. And mental health outcomes. For men, we saw reductions in depression and suicidal thoughts in the past month. Finally, a kind of around more SRH kind of outcomes. For women, we didn't actually see any. We didn't see an impact on HIV testing, but 2/3 of the women already had children, and in South Africa, HIV testing during pregnancy is almost universal. Nor did we see an impact on condom use at last sex or transactional sex amongst women. For men, it's a bit more positive. We did see an increase in HIV testing, and a greater proportion reported that the last person they had sex with was their main partner rather than another partner. So in this pilot, we do see this big mix of outcomes where we see a range of things moving in the directions we'd like it to. Even though we were very focused on reducing violence only, we can start to see these connections emerging. And just on the qualitative research, we've only really looked at the men's qualitative research because of various funny things to do with my research team. But interestingly, we were very interested to see that while men did start to change, it wasn't huge changes they described, but subtle softenings in relationships. And I think, as Marty said about the importance of the enabling environment, the social contexts were incredibly important. So the role of families, of girlfriend, in pushing men towards changing. Lots of men described how people thought they'd grown up, and girlfriends' families supported them growing up, or so-called growing up, which just meant kind of taking on slightly different roles. Kind of ways of being young men. The qualitative research with women, the money did help them, but where we often think of women using money that they earn to kind of get out of challenging relationships or violent relationships, we didn't seem to see that. So it wasn't about them developing new relationships, but they used it to help them build stronger relationships with their ongoing partner, and hopefully slightly less kind of tension in those, a bit less violent, because there was more money, which seemed to be one of the underlying kind of struggles in this community. So I just wanted to quickly say we're now doing a much bigger study with a control arm, which is currently ongoing. We're currently at 12 months. Just to say a few things about this, it's also an informal settlement. So we'll be finished. If we finish by June 2018, we'll be very lucky, much more likely October 2018. At that point, we'll know whether the intervention works quantitatively. But we've also got a lot of qualitative research ongoing. You know, Alice highlighted the importance of that sort of approach for getting a lot more nuance and understanding kind of things that come up. So we've got about 20 men and 20 women in a qualitative cohort where we're interviewing them at baseline, at 12 months, and again just before they do their final quantitative interview. And we're also using other techniques like photo voice with young women to really explore kind of issues around reproductive choices, in fact. So really to try and see how an intervention, which we're really interested in, the violence outcomes, how it can have these broader impacts and how do women use it in different ways. And we also have a separate cost-effectiveness analysis, because I think one of our big problems is it's 63 hours, it's quite a lot of effort. So we need to show that it's a cost-effective approach if we get good outcomes. And then just quickly, I've got a couple of minutes just to say there are a number of implementation issues we're finding, and I think it's one of those things that everyone grapples with, how we think we need these 21 sessions, 63 hours. It's a huge amount of work. A lot of it is probably down to the constraints due to the trial design. So we have a number of things about how we recruit people, about not letting people into sessions if they've not really been recruited at baseline. We also came up against the whole kind of that young people 18 to 30 are actually looking for work. Men especially obviously were much more concerned about finding work and leaving kind of sessions to go and work. Women, a bit more around childcare, but also work as well for them. We also faced huge challenges, and I think many people will recognise these, with issues about holidays. There's lots of migration internally in South Africa, so when we hit Easter, when we hit Christmas, people leave for rural areas and then sometimes stay there, return to other places. But we also hit a lot of political turmoil with elections in South Africa. So I think the big issue of these kind of approaches is the time to find, the clear time to find it, so you can do it in one go rather than break it up. Also, as Alice has touched on, training and support for facilitators. We know that highly skilled facilitators, her peers are entirely the best people to do these things, and yet even if they've come out of the intervention, have graduated, as one or two of our facilitators had, or through similar programs that the NGO we worked with was doing, they still require a huge amount of support, over and above what is often allowed through funding schemes. So just to give a quick summary, there are huge missed opportunities, I think, for kind of assessing these interventions for mixture of kind of violence and HIV outcomes. That's one of the big things that we're pushing. We've got this pilot study, Stepping Stones Creating Futures, which shows great promise, and then we'll see in 2018 what is out. And then just to thank the team. So I've got colleagues both at HERD at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, at the South African Medical Research Council, and Project Empower, who are the NGO who helped develop the intervention and are actually implementing it. So I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for that presentation on Stepping Stones and Creating Futures. Next, we have Kate Plourde. She is Senior Technical Officer within the Global Health Population and Nutrition Department, and she will talk about PYD and SRH programs.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of YouthPower Action's work with you today. Before I jump in, I wanted to just take a few slides to set the stage for some of the work that we're doing with YouthPower Action. It is well known that adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health outcomes are influenced by a complex set of factors across the socio-ecological framework. These include individual knowledge and behavior, biological factors, social networks, social norms, and power disparities, and access to resources, including economic and educational opportunities. This figure is probably familiar to many of you. This was developed by Bob Bloom and his colleagues, and it appeared in the Lancet Adolescent Health in the 21st Century article. Just a small note on vernacular. Often we talk about assets in the positive youth development literature, and traditionally in the sexual and reproductive health literature, we refer to these as protective factors and risk factors. So when we talk about the complex set of factors, hello?
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
So sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what happened. So when we talk about the complex set of factors that affect adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health, we're talking about factors that can either be protective or factors that can be risk factors. So for example, poor contraceptive knowledge is a risk factor for negative health outcomes, while access to youth-friendly services is a protective factor. So given this complex nature of young people's sexual and reproductive health, it's not surprising that we have this growing body of literature demonstrating that approaches to improve adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health require a holistic, assets-based approach that's grounded in the principles of positive youth development. So as YouthPower Action, we utilize YouthPower Learning's definition of positive youth development. And this is the definition that Kishna shared at the beginning of the webinar, and it's displayed again here, so I won't read that out loud. So what we did at YouthPower Action was, with the intention of building evidence to guide our programming, we conducted a series of reviews. And I'm going to share some of the learnings from just two of those reviews today that are related specifically to positive youth development in adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health. The first was a review of the types of mentoring programs for adolescent girls and young women that have demonstrated effectiveness in improving the protective assets or protective factors needed to circumvent poor reproductive health. And the second review sought to identify the features of effective integrated workforce development and sexual and reproductive health programs for youth. To understand the types of mentoring programs for adolescent girls and young women that have demonstrated effectiveness in improving their protective assets and or the reproductive health knowledge, intentions, and behaviors or outcomes themselves, our team conducted a systematic review of the peer-reviewed and gray literature. We compared interventions based on implementation via a one-on-one model or a group-based model. The majority of the interventions that we identified actually applied a one-on-one model and were largely implemented in the U.S. We found that mentoring programs, both those delivered via a group-based model or the one-on-one model, were associated with improved self-esteem, self-efficacy, and improved social networks. But group-based interventions, even though they were less common in the literature, showed more impact for improving adolescent girls and young women's reproductive health and for reducing their HIV risk than the one-on-one approach. Group-based mentoring programs demonstrated improvements across multiple outcomes of interest, including reproductive health knowledge and behavior, academic achievement, financial behavior, improved social networks, and decreases in the experience of violence. So given all that we're talking about this morning, it's not surprising that the results of our review also demonstrated that the most successful mentoring programs incorporated additional components beyond just relationship building with a mentor. Many of those sought to directly improve adolescent girls and young women's protective assets, and they aligned with the core domains and features of positive youth development that Marty presented earlier today. For example, many programs included the delivery of curriculum-based education on reproductive health, gender, and financial literacy. So these particular components align with the assets building domain and the skills building features of the positive youth development framework. Access to safe social spaces was also associated with better sexual and reproductive health outcomes, where participants were able to develop and strengthen their peer network. We also saw improved outcomes, and these again align with positive youth development domains, such as the enabling environment and the healthy relationships and safe space features of the positive youth development framework. We saw similar results when looking across the literature on integrated sexual and reproductive health and workforce development programs. So this review, as I previously mentioned, was sought to establish the current landscape of integrated workforce and SRH programs, to understand where such programs are implemented, the specific program components that are delivered and how those are delivered, who integrated programs are designed to reach, and the existing evidence on the impact of those programs. So the review consisted of 4 steps that are outlined in this diagram here: identifying the projects, creating an inventory, coding them, analyzing the data, and developing a theory of change. In addition to the review, we formed a consultative group comprised of leading experts in both workforce development and sexual and reproductive health to advise our process and to review our recommendations and results. Again, we found that the programs that adopted the more holistic approach that focused on fostering positive personal relationships, a supportive environment, and access to services alongside conventional workforce development and SRH components had a better impact than those that did not. So this table here shows the specific intervention components common among programs with the greatest impact. And you can see that these findings also align with the positive youth development domains. From this review of workforce development and sexual and reproductive health programs, we developed this framework to guide integrated workforce development and sexual and reproductive health programming. You can see that the core elements of the theory of change are the combination of skills and knowledge building, opportunities to build positive relationships in safe spaces, and a supportive, enabling environment. One thing to note with this framework that we developed is that while our review did not actually identify a high number of published evaluations of programs that sought to increase access to sexual and reproductive health services or that incorporated employer consultations, because both are evidence-based practices, our team felt they were very critical to include in the theory of change, and we also received input from the consultative groups supporting this addition. So as the common theme throughout today's webinar, programs that apply a positive youth development approach to adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health appear to have a greater impact than traditional approaches that often address reproductive health from a problem-based philosophy or fail to address young people's multifaceted needs in a holistic manner. However, this evidence base is emerging and more research is needed. In particular, studies examining the relative impact of various intervention components and the combination of those components is needed to ensure that programs are implementing the most effective combination for their beneficiaries. Both of our reviews identified gaps in the evidence for particular populations and geographic regions. Like Marty, we found very few programs in Latin America and the Caribbean across either of the reviews. And we did not identify any programs reaching GLTBQ youth in the SRH and workforce review. So there's still a lot of evidence to build, but from what's emerging, it's quite strong. Here are some resources. I've included the toolkit here in this list, even though you've seen it before, as well as some of the YouthPower action resources that may be beneficial or interesting to this audience. So I'm just a few minutes ahead of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you all the presenters. I'm going to open the floor to questions and answers. The first question I have is for Marty, and it's in regards to recommendations 1 to 3 on your slides, and we're just going to scroll to that slide. Can you do this slide about the recommendations from the systematic review?
Yes, I'm sorry the slide kind of got slipped through without being able to talk about it. So in addition to the recommendations that I did discuss, the recommendations include, and this is very consistent with everything you've heard this morning, that implementers can leverage the existing resources, which we've been talking about. And I would just like to emphasize that there are ways to integrate this more holistic and more positive approach into every phase of program development and evaluation. And so, so one of the recommendations, of course, is to use those resources and to infuse positive youth development features and elements into existing developments of programs. And of course, we also really want to have an impact on funders to recommend that they be investing in these cross-sectoral approaches, because that's really where we think the payoff for positive youth development is. And then third, just that everybody should be targeting positive youth development approaches in the most holistic way possible. That we also did not find programming that specifically addressed the LGBTI community and the special issues that come up for people who are in that category, and that youth with disabilities, we didn't see any special programming that would address the particular challenges that face kids with disabilities. So I don't think any of these recommendations are a surprise, but I appreciate having the chance to go over them. I'm sorry I missed them to start with. Thank you.
Thanks for reviewing those. We appreciate it. The next question is for Alice. Why do stepping stones focus on activities involving men and women separately?
Okay, thank you. I just want to try and scroll down through the slides to the fission and fusion slide. So I've gone too far. Let me try going up again. So basically, the idea of that fission and fusion slide, that roadmap of the program, was to show how peer groups are in their 4 separate peer groups for several sessions, and then they come together so that in the, there we go, that fission and fusion slide. So the first A through to G sessions, they're in their separate peer groups of older men, older women, younger men, younger women. And then they come together, so they, by that time they've already started doing role plays around their own experiences, etc. and they share them with each other and comment and question and so on. And then they go back into their separate peer groups for more sessions, and then they come together again. So that's separate and together, separate and together. The reason why we have them in separate peer groups for so many sessions is because in each peer group, based on the same gender and similar age to you, you may be wanting to talk about things which actually would just be really embarrassing. It's embarrassing enough talking about them anyway, but it would just be hopeless trying to talk about them in front of someone of a different gender or different age from you. So, for example, girls might be wanting to talk about their periods. Boys might be wanting to talk, say, about ejaculation, or boys are often supposed to have all the knowledge about sex in their minds already. They're supposed to be born with it, and it's often really difficult for boys then actually to learn about sex. And so this gives them a safe environment to learn about it without girls laughing at them. Obviously well facilitated. And then, for instance, older women may be wanting to talk about childbirth, for example, or older men might be wanting to talk, say, about prostate problems and sexual dysfunction. So, you can imagine in each separate peer group, there are going to be a whole range of different issues, which is much easier to address through sensitive facilitation within that separate gender and age-based peer group. But then they come together with their more generalized role plays to present to each other in those shared sessions where that's building that sense of we identity and building bridges across the different groups. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
This question is actually for all the presenters. One of the findings from the systematic review were that rigorous evaluations of PYD programs is needed. However, the challenge is that RCTs are expensive. So what recommendations do you have to advance the field given this challenge? Let's start off with Alice.
Okay, well, then let's come back down to that diagram that I showed about the ALIVE framework, which Andy and I have been involved in with UNAIDS, where the DFID review, which I mentioned, really talked about the importance of engaging with communities and really strengthening partnership with communities to understand what's going on for them in their own lives. And what we really encourage thinking about in this ALIVE framework is really thinking about both formal and participatory, quantitative and qualitative parallel processes, so that we're really trying to build a much more holistic research matrix, not just holistic cross-sectoral approaches, but the whole research process involving young people as well as elder people from the outset in really developing the whole method around how people are going to evaluate the program. And if we learn from community members themselves, again, in those separate peer groups, what does change look like for you? What is your vision? How are you going to measure how we're moving towards that? Then that's a real sense of ownership development and a real sense of sustainability and quite deserved pride in progress, as well as, of course, unexpected outcomes perhaps coming out of it. So, I think that it's a win-win for us all, basically, if we move towards this. And Andy, I'm sure Andy would answer as well, much more effectively than I can.
Yes, Andy, you also talked in your presentation about some of the challenges about delivering interventions as well. Any key recommendations that you have to advance the field given the challenges that you also spoke about?
Yeah, so I think in some ways these kind of big quantitative evaluations are required, just because they're the things which the donors like, which get kind of money kind of starts to accrue to them if you get good outcomes. So you do need to do these, and I guess it's doing them in ways which kind of, well, firstly, kind of to reiterate what Alice said, looking at different ways of evaluating them, but I still think the formal and quantitative is required. I know there's been a lot of USAID-funded programs. I'm involved in evaluating, say, the DREAMS program in South Africa, where it's happening, it's being rolled out, and they're funding a separate, well, a kind of add-on evaluation. So we're not getting money to do the implementation, but we are getting money to evaluate. And I know a number of those kind of things where people are thinking, how can we do the delivery which we've already promised, and then also add on an evaluation so we get some form of kind of quantitative outcome, which are kind of quite compelling, and I guess that's the big thing. But yeah, as Alice had said earlier, there's this review where they said, you know, while quantitative evaluations are incredibly compelling, they're not necessarily the things which transform kind of programming and policy at a national or global level, but engagement of stakeholders, key stakeholders early on, as well as participants, and really kind of developing kind of recommendations and engaging people through the process can lead to much better outcomes. But at some level we still need these big kind of evaluations, probably, I think. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Andy. And for Kate, in your presentation you talked about that there were gaps in evidence from specific populations and in certain geographic regions. Can you provide any recommendations on what populations that we need to target or where we need to focus some of our efforts in SRH programming?
Sure, thank you. So building on the need for more evidence, I would say applying this positive youth development approach to adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health is somewhat of a gap generally. More of us are doing it. There is emerging evidence. We're seeing it in, you know, these two specific approaches, mentoring and integrated workforce and SRH. But I would say overall, there's just a need for more funding generally. Then there were specific groups that were just completely excluded. We found very little information or evidence on mentoring approaches for young men. We found geographic gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean in both reviews. We found that programs specifically targeting GLBTQ groups, that, you know, there was no evidence for those. So there were specific areas and populations where this work is not being documented, and then just generally a need to sort of do more.
Thank you, Kate. The next question is for Alice and Andy. Both presenters identified attrition issues with facilitators. What are some ways that you have met this challenge?
Andy, do you want to go first?
I was going to say the same to you. But yeah, let me just go first. Thanks, Alice. Yeah, it's a huge problem. I think Alice has pointed out rightly that a lot of the problems are down to the funding streams. If you can't offer people kind of long-term permanent posts, they'll always be on the lookout, you know, for their next job, and so they'll kind of skip through just because, you know, as I will, because my contract's up at the end of 2018, you know, if it's not been renewed by that point, you know, 6 months before, I'll be looking for a new job too. So I think there are these kind of huge structural problems we're talking about. I guess the other side of stuff is the kind of softer side of stuff, that it is a very stressful, kind of challenging thing. The young people we've worked with are kind of related, you know, come out of the communities where they're then going back to facilitate and working. So if not that community, they understand and kind of can get on with the participants very well. Now, obviously, the communities we're working in have huge burden of violence and issues, so that their daily work is incredibly stressful, which has kind of huge kind of burdens on them. So I guess providing a huge amount of support. So the NGO we work with, a lot, Project Empower, will do kind of weekly debriefing sessions, on a Friday they do them, lasting kind of 2/3 of the day, where it's not just about what did you do, but it's also about talking about the challenges and problems. We've sent facilitators to counselling where necessary. So I think we've got these major structural issues, and it's very hard to fight against them. And then we can work much more concretely on providing a supportive space for facilitators. I'm sure Alice has some good ideas and better ideas than that.
Thanks, Andy. Well, I'm just going to add to what Andy said, because everything Andy said, of course, I'm sure resonates with so many of you. Just a couple of things. I think one of the frustrating things, I think, is that this short-termism of projects really means then that, some facilitators who are really great are being made redundant, as Andy said. And in fact, in the Gambia, already a while ago, they decided that they would set up a national facilitators network so that amongst them, no matter whether or not they were employed in a particular project, at least they had each other to support them. And similarly in Kenya and in Uganda and Tanzania, they've been trying to set up similar national facilitators networks, just so that they can pool their own experiences and at least keep something going, even when they're self-employed between them. But they're also finding it really difficult to get funds just to even register, which is really frustrating because, it's a huge idea, I think, which really is so needed. But at the same time, I think at the front end of it, this investment in facilitation skills when people first start a project is so key. And the thing is that, in the old days, you used to have permanent program staff, and then perhaps they would want to start up a new program, such as Stepping Stones or whatever. And so there was you could see the sense of spending the time investing in the training because you knew that they were going to go on being there, and because new project funding would come along. Whereas nowadays, because of the climate that we're all in, we're saying you've really got to invest in the training to get the facilitators really understanding what the program's about, and to be fair to them, to let them go through it for themselves first so they can really internalize the issues and understand how challenging some of these issues are, even for them in their own lives. And yet people say, no, you can't do that, we haven't got time, there isn't enough money in the budget, it takes too long. And the irony is then you actually end up with really poorly facilitated programs at times when facilitators really just understand the very basic nuts and bolts and really don't understand the depth of the program. So, there's a huge challenge for all of us because you end up with actually programs which just might have the name but have nothing of the content or the quality that they should have. So it's a massive challenge all round, I think, that we really need to be looking at.
Thank you, Alice. Another finding from the systematic review were that effective programs integrated gender into their programming. This question is for all the presenters. In what ways are gender-related issues integrated in your programming? Kate, can you start off answering this question? Thank you.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, both of these reviews were conducted with an eye towards implementing programming. So we've since started implementing under YouthPower Action an adolescent girls mentoring program in Uganda and in Burundi. And this programming includes content that is gender aware and gender transformative. And we found across the reviews that this was one piece of curricula-based content that was often included in the most successful programs. We are currently working to identify a partner who is interested in implementing a workforce development and SRH program, either one that is currently being implemented or if they are implementing one sector and they're interested in incorporating another, that we can work with them and provide a little bit of TA and learning. So in that sense, we're a little bit of a step behind with the workforce and SRH piece of the mentoring. But we also found for those programs in our review that gender content was critically important, and we expect that when we get to the stage of implementation, we will incorporate that as well.
Thank you, Kate. Andy, in what ways are gender-related issues integrated in the programming that you discussed?
Yeah, so I guess they're central to it. The Stepping Stones kind of approach is really focused on the commitment to gender equality, and it kind of runs through it. You know, both in sessions, a bit like Alice has already mentioned, but I think throughout, as we moved into creating features as well, we've tried to think about how to get people reflecting on kind of gender within the context of work a little as well, and how things like childcare impacts on kind of people's access to work. So I think, you know, the only way these are going to work is, you know, the reviews kind of said, is through this kind of commitment to gender equality. So it's kind of the central thing, that kind of thread that runs through the intervention of Stepping Stones and creating futures.
Thanks, Andy. And Alice, I know you already reviewed the infusion slide, but do you have anything else to add?
Well, I was just thinking in a program in Uganda, one of the young men at the end of the program, he said, you know, when we first started this program, we used to think that girls were the problem and they were the ones who brought AIDS into our community. And we've now realized that actually we're all in this together, and that they're actually, you know, they've been with us on this journey, and you know, ideally they're the ones that we'd like to marry in future, because, you know, they understand us now, we understand them, and that wasn't the case before. So I think that kind of puts us in a nutshell, because that's basically what we want the program to achieve. You know, we've got those peer groups from the outset, based on generation as well as gender. All the way through, you know, I think it was very interactive learning. All the way through, we've got role plays where we're asking peer groups to think about a situation that you or someone like you has found themselves in, to do with, you know, something you've been proud of, or someone with a sticky situation or whatever. And there's always then men and women, or girls and boys, in the role play. So somebody in the peer group has to be role playing somebody of another gender to their own. And so they have to really think themselves into it. And we keep on asking these circular questions. What do you think they're thinking? What do you think their reaction would be if you said this? So they're really kind of being challenged all the time to think outside their own comfort zone around their own experiences. And that's what we call the critical literacy, really understanding from different perspectives. And so that's how it's built all the way through, because it's in every single session, just going on and building up that sense of shared understanding.
Thank you, Alice. And I also want to thank all the presenters for participating in this webinar. The recording, presentation, and any resources will be shared to all the registrants, and we will also post the HIV/AIDS and SRH brief on the youthpower.org website. I see there's one last question about funding for this in the U.S. Any additional questions we will send out on also to the registrants as well, as I want to be mindful of our time. Thank you all.
Sarah?